Hey there, folks. Clyde Chester here. And tonight, I need to tell you about some of the bravest women in American history. Women who quite literally glowed in the dark, who fought one of the most powerful corporations in America while their bodies were falling apart, and who changed workplace safety laws forever. I'm talking about the Radium Girls of New Jersey. Young women who went to work painting watch dials in the 1910s and 1920s, thinking they had landed dream jobs, only to discover they'd been slowly poisoned by their own employers. This is a story about corporate greed, about courage in the face of unimaginable suffering, and about how sometimes it takes tragedy to force America to protect its workers. Let me take you back to 1917, to a factory in Orange, New Jersey, run by the United States Radium Corporation. World War I was raging in Europe, and there was huge demand for watches and instruments with luminous dials, watches that soldiers could read in the trenches at night, airplane instruments that pilots could see in the dark, military equipment that glowed without needing electricity. And the secret ingredient that made these dials glow was radium, a newly discovered element that seemed almost magical. It glowed with an eerie green light. It was exciting, it was modern, and as far as anyone knew in 1917, it was perfectly safe. The United States Radium Corporation was making a fortune painting watch dials with a special radium-based paint they called Undark. And to do this delicate work, they hired young women, mostly teenagers and women in their early 20s, because women were believed to have steadier hands and better attention to detail than men. The pay was good. Really good for women at that time, more than 3 times what you could make working in a factory or as a domestic servant. For working-class girls in New Jersey, many of them daughters of immigrants, this seemed like winning the lottery. The factory hired dozens of young women, and it became a social hub. These weren't just co-workers, they were friends, sisters, neighbors from the same Italian and Irish communities. Girls like Grace Fryer, Quinta McDonald, Catherine Schaub, Albina Larice, Edna Hussman. They'd walk to work together, eat lunch together, gossip about boys and movies and their dreams for the future. The work itself seemed almost glamorous. They sat at long tables in a bright studio, painting tiny numbers onto watch dials with the finest brushes imaginable, using paint that glowed like starlight. And here's where the nightmare begins. The radium paint was thick and gloppy, and the work required incredible precision. You had to paint numbers less than a quarter-inch high onto tiny watch faces. The brushes would lose their fine points after just a few strokes, so the supervisors taught the girls a technique called lip pointing or tipping. You'd put the brush in your mouth, purse your lips around it to bring the bristles to a fine point, dip it in the radium paint, paint a few numbers, then put it back in your mouth to repoint it. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. Over and over, hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a week. The girls ingested radium with every brush tip. They breathed in radium dust that hung in the air of the studio. The radium got on their hands, their clothes, their hair, and because radium glowed, the girls themselves began to glow. They'd leave work at the end of the day with their clothes shimmering in the twilight, their hair sparkled. If you turned off the lights, you could see the outline of their bodies glowing green in the dark. The girls thought it was fantastic, magical even. They'd paint their nails and their teeth with the radium paint before going out dancing on Saturday nights, so they'd glow under the lights at the dance halls. Some of them painted their faces like makeup. It was fun. It was special. They called themselves the Ghost Girls. What they didn't know, what the company knew but never told them, was that radium was killing them. See, the men who worked for U.S. Radium Corporation, the chemists and the scientists, they knew radium was dangerous. They worked with it using lead screens, tongs, and masks. They never touched it directly. They never ingested it. The company president, Arthur Roeder, was so careful about radium exposure that he refused to even tour the factory floor where the girls worked. The company's chief physicist, Edwin Lehman, used an ivory-tipped rod to handle radium and wore protective equipment. But when the dial painters asked if the paint was safe, they were told absolutely, it was harmless. Some supervisors even told the girls that radium was good for them, that it would make their cheeks rosy and give them energy. It was all lies. Radium is what's called a bone seeker. When you ingest it, your body mistakes it for calcium and deposits it in your bones and teeth, where it sits, radioactive and deadly, emitting alpha particles that destroy your bone tissue from the inside out. The girls were swallowing radium multiple times every single day. The dose was cumulative, building up in their skeletons like a slow-acting poison that would take years to manifest. The first girl to get sick was Amelia Maggia. Molly was in her early 20s, vivacious and popular, one of 5 sisters who all worked at the factory. In 1921, she started having tooth problems, terrible pain in her jaw, her teeth becoming loose. She went to the dentist, who pulled the affected teeth, but the pain didn't stop. Her jaw wouldn't heal. In fact, the bone in her jaw began to deteriorate. The dentist pulled more teeth, trying to help, but it only got worse. Her jaw started to crumble. Pieces of her jawbone would break off in her mouth. The pain was excruciating, and nothing helped. Not medicine, not surgery, nothing. By 1922, Molly couldn't walk. Her legs had fractured spontaneously. The bones had become so weak that they broke under her own weight. She was hemorrhaging from the mouth constantly, the blood glowing faintly green in the dark. On September 12, 1922, Molly Maggia died. She was 24 years old. Her death certificate said she died of syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease. It was a lie, a vicious lie meant to protect the company and slander Molly's reputation. The real cause was radium poisoning, but the company doctor had falsified the records. And Molly wasn't the only one getting sick. More girls started experiencing the same symptoms: tooth pain, jaw deterioration, spontaneous fractures, anemia, exhaustion. Sarah Mailford died in 1923. Hazel Kusser died in 1923. Marguerite Karloff was so sick she could barely move. Quinta McDonald's teeth fell out and her jaw disintegrated. Grace Fryer developed severe anemia and her spine started to compress. These young women, who'd been healthy and vibrant just a few years earlier, were falling apart. The women went to doctors, desperate for answers, but most doctors had never seen anything like this. Some blamed the symptoms on syphilis or other venereal diseases, despite zero evidence. It was easier to blame the victims than to investigate an industrial cause. Others said the women were hysterical, that their symptoms were psychosomatic. The United States Radium Corporation, meanwhile, denied everything. They said the work was safe. They said the girls' illnesses had nothing to do with the factory. They hired doctors to examine the sick women and issue reports saying radium couldn't possibly be the cause. But Grace Fryer wasn't buying it. Grace was a bank teller by then. She'd left the radium factory in 1920, and by 1925, she was getting sicker by the day. Her jaw was deteriorating. Her spine was crumbling. Every movement caused her pain. She'd seen too many of her former co-workers die the same way. She knew in her bones, her radioactive, crumbling bones, that the radium had done this to them. So, Grace decided to fight back. She decided to sue. Finding a lawyer willing to take U.S. Radium was nearly impossible. This was a powerful corporation with deep pockets and political connections. They could afford the best lawyers in the country. And Grace was a dying woman with no money, no power, no influence. 2 years she searched, knocking on door after door, being turned away again and again. Finally, in 1927, she found a lawyer named Raymond Berry who was willing to take the case. And once word got out, 4 other women joined the lawsuit: Quinta McDonald, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Albina Larice, and Edna Hussman. They became known as the Radium Girls, and their case would captivate the nation. The lawsuit was filed in 1927, but actually getting to trial proved almost impossible. U.S. Radium used every legal trick in the book to delay. They filed motion after motion, requested postponement after postponement. Their strategy was obvious and heartless. They were waiting for the women to die. And why not? Every day that passed, the plaintiffs got weaker. Grace Fryer couldn't raise her arms above her head. Quinta McDonald was in constant pain. Edna Hussman could barely walk. The company's lawyers knew that dead women can't testify. But the Radium Girls refused to die quietly. Even as their bodies failed them, they showed up to every hearing, every deposition. Newspaper reporters started covering the case, and the public was outraged. Here were these young women who'd worked hard and trusted their employer, who'd been lied to and poisoned by the very company that had destroyed their lives. The story of the glowing girls who were suing for justice became national news. The company tried to discredit them. They hired doctors to testify that radium wasn't dangerous, that the women's illnesses were caused by other factors. They suggested the women had syphilis or tuberculosis. They claimed the women were lying about their symptoms to get money.
It was character assassination of the cruelest kind, aimed at women who were literally disintegrating from the inside out. But Grace Fryer wasn't buying it. Dr. Harrison Matland, a brilliant pathologist, had been studying radium poisoning, and he'd developed a test that could detect radium in living tissue. He examined the women and proved conclusively that their bodies were radioactive. He exhumed the body of Amelia Madja, remember her, one of the first to die, whose death certificate falsely claimed syphilis, and found that even 5 years after death, her bones were so radioactive they exposed photograph film. The evidence was irrefutable. In 1928, after months of delays, the case finally got a hearing. The Radium Girls, so sick they could barely sit upright, came to court. Grace Fryer had to be carried into the courtroom. She could no longer walk. The sight of these dying women, struggling